Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the sassy, human-shaped robot with a heart of gold,
William Trent Hergenrader.
Tick-tock, clink-clank. That's the robot noise that we make.
Clink.
Yes. This week, we're excited to have another exceptional guest, a scholar whose work in situated cognition, ecological psychology, and educational technology inspired so much of our thinking and research about playful learning and world building, Dr. Michael F. Young. In addition to having served as my major doctoral advisor and closest colleague at the University of Connecticut, Mike is a professor emeritus of learning sciences, as well as a research associate professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering. It's a lot of words, a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Not nonsense. Synonyms. A lot of nonsense. It's a lot of nonsense. Early in his career, he was a member of John Bransford's paradigm-defining cognition and technology group at Vanderbilt and worked as an instructional designer with Honeywell. He's completed several civic tours of duty as an elected member for Arlington, Connecticut's Board of Education. And as Mike's CV is replete with articles, book chapters, and presentations about the wise integration of technology in K-12, university, and corporate classrooms, we're very much looking forward to hearing his hot takes on contemporary learning theory and instructional design. So without further ado, thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hi.
Wow, that was less inspired.
I did what you told me to say.
I did tell him to say hi. So thank you, Michael. Roles reversed. So I don't have a formal question to kick this off. As I mentioned in that sprawling introduction, I've known you, Mike, for a very long time now, or at least a long time.
Yeah, so thank you for skipping all the really horrible parts.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to scare everybody off. Yeah, exactly. Right. I didn't want to relive the experience of my dissertation. I will say that when I met you, it was the first day I ever met Mike Young was the first day of my teacher education program. The class we had before all others was Ed Tech, and you thoroughly embarrassed me by asking everybody in the room, had they ever played a massively multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft? And I sheepishly raised my hand as the only person.
That's not true. I raised my hand too.
True. The other 19 people in the room, though, they kind of looked at us oddly as you started to explain your thinking about gnome warlocks and what that meant for molten core. And I'm sitting there sort of sinking in my chair, not wanting to talk about this, embarrassing myself in front of all these people I didn't know. So that's one lived experience that I can keep drawing on.
I'm sorry that my teaching was so terrifying, but later on I learned that you were very good at it, particularly in ganking the fellow players at fishing on a lovely Sunday afternoon.
And that's why we embraced one another as advisor and advisee. Okay, enough of that nonsense. The reason why we wanted to have you on specifically was because you and I had a conversation last week about generative AI and what that means for education and how that interfaces with your work as both a scholar as well as somebody who's seen the practical applications of technology in classroom environments through the Board of Education lens. That's a little bit different than being a classroom teacher, of course, but it's a valuable perspective that I think a lot of people don't actually hear much about. I mean, there's not a lot of people who show up to Board of Education meetings and sit through the proceedings there. They also, I think, this is another thing that you had mentioned to me, aren't necessarily thinking like somebody who's the superintendent who's going to you specifically for that kind of information, that kind of expertise. And so I guess I'll kick this off by asking you, what kinds of ed tech implementations are you thinking about? What does that have to do with instructional design in the 21st century? And what do you foresee as being the long vision of what education is or should be?
I don't think any of us could answer that question definitively, Steve, but I would say that perhaps generative AI more than even previous technologies, and you've written about this in the epic fail papers we've thought about together. Mm-hmm. But generative AI challenges teachers to change the way they teach and learn. They think about learning. And you and I both taught learning theory somewhere in our wicked past. And when you think about that, or at least when I think about when we were teaching future teachers how cognitive psychologists think about learning, we've tried to get them to do their own philosophy. We kind of said, there are all these competing theories. There's a little bit of behaviorism that's still there in schools. There's a little bit of cognitivism and social cognitivism there. There's a little bit of constructivism that seeps into some classrooms. There's even some contemporary thoughts about cognitive neuroscience, SITCOG, embodied cognition, and the like. But basically, we're just trying to get them to understand what they were reading in the textbook and kind of make it their own. But things like generative AI kind of make that a moot point. Yes, you have to understand it in your own way, but nothing in your experiential past of teaching and learning is really going to make you change the way you think about assignments to kids the way generative AI does. And in 3010, in our learning theory class, while that philosophy statement was kind of the pinnacle of what we wanted to have students achieve, that they knew the content that was in the textbook, they could cite it with APA-style references, and they were correct in kind of applying it to whether they were going to be nurses or whether they're going to be football coaches, or even if going into the science classroom or the music classroom, right? Those are all different and required them to think a little bit and a little bit of application. But these days, you could ask AI to do that too. What does behaviorism have to do with the music classroom or the marching band? And it could give you a pretty good response. What we're going to need them to do is kind of know the limits of those theories and be creative about composing new connections, not just to their domain, but knowing all 3 or 4 of those different learning theories enough to know the one that they're implementing now has some limitations. And so AI would probably tell me all about behaviorism and how it applies to my classroom, but it probably wouldn't think about other things and what the limits of what they're telling me, because it's designed, as you know, at least the agentic AI, to kind of validate the question you ask it. Tell me how to wisely use behaviorism. It's not going to necessarily tell you what the limits of that are and where to think about edge cases where what you're doing. I think we talked about one kind of student who had a traumatic, almost PTSD upbringing, and that ideas of punishment and reward were triggering for that child. And so you couldn't just double down on a behavior management plan for that child. You'd really have to think, well, what other kind of learning theories might get me out of this? That ones that maybe address the emotional part of it or the contextual parts of it. So I'd say that's what we have to think about. We're challenged to kind of take the existing, what we thought was great education and great teaching, and change it in ways that AI is now a thought partner and fills in all that almost wise application stuff. But now it's going to require us to be higher level thinking about things and maybe the divergent thinking about it, as you suggest.
Yeah, I had mentioned before we started that I've had stuck in the back of my mind this notion of convergent versus divergent thinking, and the notion that AI, as Trent and I have discussed on this podcast multiple times, AI is really oriented toward finding the median answer to a question. It's just taking all the information available and averaging it out and giving you what the statistical model suggests would be the most applicable answer.
Based on the correlations to the prompt you gave it.
Yeah,
so you're not super at prompting. You're not prompting it to think about everything and be divergent. You're not going to get divergent.
Right. And I think that actually comes right back to this question of world building, where, as Trent has suggested previously, generative AI or similar technologies have a role to play because you can utilize them to coalesce different kinds of information in ways that would be impractical or time consuming as an individual person. Like Trent, I think, used the example of looking at a teenager in 16th century or 17th century Massachusetts. What would their life have been like? If I want to go do that research, it's going to take me a lot of time and a lot of reading, and I might find a Wikipedia page that has some relevant things, but it won't have a lot of them. And that database of information, the training data, might be able to pull in more than I ever individually would even know to go looking for. But that's completely different than applying that consolidated information, that convergent information, in diverse and interesting and individualized ways, which is why I think the question of Gen AI, or even just broadly, what are we trying to accomplish in education? It's not necessarily, or at least it shouldn't necessarily be, to get students to converge on one quote unquote correct answer, but to get them to think in these multivalenced or multidimensional kinds of ways that apply both their specific lived experiences as well as that stuff that's being aggregated using a tool like generative AI. I don't know. Do you think I characterized that correctly, Trent, or at least in the ways that we've kind of discussed it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this one of the questions too. So, Mike, you said, you need to be able to prompt it, right? So this is one of the questions: is to what extent should educators be teaching students to prompt AI? Is that going to be a core skill? And then the other part of it that I think is really sort of fascinating and weird is that we all will have had our entire education career with never having AI in, for the most part, the internet, right? And now it's like, okay, well, that's just part of what my kids, they grew up with the internet, right? And now it's not going to take very long before there's a generation that will have never lived without using AI. So one of the questions is, what is the student's role? How is the student going to be the leader for maybe some of their older instructors? And then what are some of the, wisdom or experience that instructors are going to need to be able to turn around and share with their students? Because one of the things, like when you're saying, oh, well, AI will throw a bunch of stuff about behaviorism about you, right, to you. Well, you know what's right and what's wrong, right? So, like, oh, that's a nuanced point that's kind of glossing over. But if you don't have any of that in your locker, you just, you're going to trust it, that is the entire story. So I think those are some of the questions that I'm sort of interested in as well, is not being sort of a full Luddite, we have to turn the other direction and run. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, how to do it well when it's so new, it's being shoehorned into everything. It seems like students at the younger ages are going to be learning a bit more about it, and what it can and can't do at younger ages than many of their instructors, who are falling back on banning it and saying you don't want to use it, it's the devil's tool or whatever. So I'm notorious for like having a long-winded, multi-pronged question. So feel free to sit on any of those prongs that you wish.
Sure. First of all, I hope we all agree this is really exciting. I'm glad. I've taught for 35 years, trying to challenge teachers to think differently about how they teach. I think the stuff you mentioned in my intro, Steve, about anchored instruction, it too was meant to be subversive, right? To say, flip education on its head, and instead of teaching little simple things in isolation, why don't we just give them a complex problem in 5th grade and see how they do applying their math to that, and let them learn the math in that context, right? So I've kind of had my whole career flipping things on their heads and telling teachers we got to change this traditional sage on the stage, teaching is telling, didactic approach. Even though it has its own place, it shouldn't be in the driver's seat of learning. And I think AI and the questions you're asking, Trent, are making me think. And of course, nobody has all these answers because we're not going to live in the future, but your kids are. It's very exciting. But the pieces I would pick up on initially is, first, I'm not sure whether kids or parents, for sure, or anybody on the school board level, really understands AI. They seem to think it's human-like, that it has intention and it's answering me from some kind of conception of, you mentioned right or wrong. And when I was talking to Steve the other day, we have a tendency to have coffee and sitcog together. One of the distinctions between thinking of humans as situated and contextual, and in your work as understanding and constructing narratives and using that as a historical tool or as an understanding of my whole life tool, that easily gets personified into AI. And I hope we know that it has no intentions at all. It's tokenizing that prompt, as you said, and we'll probably have to teach children that. But first, we have to understand that. And then it's going to create some tokenized, correlational, English-like response that's going to be fascinating to another human, but to another agent, it would be nothing. It'd be, oh, what interesting correlations you brought out from that large language model, right? And that's about it. That's a distinction I think is at the heart of this idea of you saying, well, of course, when we get something back from a agentic gen AI, we have our own values. We know about behaviorism, what's right and wrong. And I think the ethical part of it is another, what do you call them, prongs or tines that I have to pick up on?
Yeah.
Because the work I'm doing now as a newly minted engineer, chemical engineer, and whatever else was in that title that I had to get to in order to get my summer pay out of being rehired by UConn. I think that's another thing we have to understand is that the responses we're getting from AI, not only do they not have intention, but they don't have any value system. They're like the telephone in some weird way, but the telephone system is just a transmission system. It never tells us anything.
Yeah.
I mean, our voice recorder probably kind of tells us something over the phone, but still, that's a human constructing it, and we can assume they had intentionality. We can't assume that whatever's spitting back from that learning model has any intentionality nor any ethics. So, for example, that gets into techie stuff because, the FCC controls with Section 230 things like social networks and the telephone company, saying you can't charge the telephone company for a person saying bad things or plotting against the government, because the telephone didn't do that, and none of the managers of the telephone system did that. And that's also been applied to social networks, right? They're just the vehicle. They're covered by Section 230 also, saying, well, that's whoever said that is responsible for that, not the person who set up a network for that to be conveyed. AI, if you think about it, is just slightly different than that. It does have original content. It is the source of these ideas, but they're not intentional and they're not ethical. So how can I hold it responsible, or can I hold the people who built the algorithms responsible? Because they're not doing it either. They're more like the telephone company. They just wrote algorithms that make correlations among English words that are all tokenized. So I would challenge you to think about that, because I still think that's very exciting. Even down to the nitty gritty of the law and ethics and what is it we're dealing with here. It's not a calculator and it's not a word processor, which our traumas education has fought through with tech, right? Banning them, loving them, including them on tests, calling them cheating. It's all the same stuff, right? And it all ends kind of in epic fail sometimes, because nothing really changes about education. What's exciting to me is something may have to change here. I think teachers, kids, the system, assessment, and how we start to do, I guess we'll throw it into Steve's divergent thinking, but these higher things, being ethical, being creative, making connections beyond what the machine responded to the tokens you gave it, that's got to change. How do we teach that? I'm not sure, but I know it's different. I know it's going to affect every assignment, every discussion we have, every book we read, every analysis we make of what's human and what's not. So I'd like to hear from you guys about that. Am I completely whacked here, or is this
not completely
different?
Well, a little bit. I guess my question
I
to
shouldn't
you,
have
Mike,
asked it that way.
my question to you, Mike. So I kind of thought that it would be helpful if you could frame the Clark-Kozma debate about technology's role in education. And then with respect to the specifics that you just laid out, do you think this is different in kind than some of the other things that we used to teach our pre-service and in-service educators about the integration of technology? Because I do wonder, now that you've kind of described the Section 230 component and the fact that AIs or large language models do construct information in some way, at least algorithmically, how is that similar or different to treating technology integration in a classroom or implementation in a classroom as like a tool or a vehicle for communicating ideas? I mean, just the way that you described it sounded different in kind to me, but I'm not sure I'm interpreting that the way you intended it.
Okay, well, I need to hear the way you heard it, because I put it in the context of it being very exciting, but we're not sure exactly what the implications are. But I do think it's different in kind. So when you talk about Clark-Kozma, is it an effect of the technology per se, or is it a richer combination of complex interactions into which you throw a new technology and its affordances, and you never know what those affordances are until you get perceivers acting on those? Kind of like we were talking about World of Warcraft. Who knew you could sit on somebody's fishing bobber and ruin their entire Sunday fishing experience until you put it in the hands of somebody and somebody does that. Well, I think we're going to see that with AI, right? And it's going to have really good implications and really bad implications.
Yeah.
At least in terms of teaching and learning. I don't even want to touch the idea that some military application of these things might start World War VI automatically because of something it does. But I do think when we're talking about how do we teach kids to read, or how do we teach them to think and compose and communicate, it is different because it's not just a technology that we're plunking down there like, oh, here's a calculator and now it can do graphing where we had to use paper and pen and everything for that. It's different. It is a thought partner, but a non-human one.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we understand both components of that it is a technology with new affordances, but it also is non-human, we're going to get better at teaching your kids.
What do you think about the fact that, so I've been using, I've used ChatGPT and Claude most recently, but with ChatGPT, one of the things that I noticed, I was using it to work on Spanish. And it would seem that OpenAI is doing the exact opposite, in which they are trying to make it seem more and more human, in which, like, when I'm doing my Spanish, it introduces longer pauses, or, you know, the speech patterns more closely represent a human. And, you know, I'm thinking, okay, well, what all of these AI, systems should be doing is saying at every available moment, I am not a human. I do not have feelings. I do not have opinions. This is, whatever. I am just spitting out the
Intentions. I do not have intentions.
I don't have intentions, right?
This is correlational.
And we know a lot of people are pretty dumb, and they're not going to know while they're doing this that this machine that maybe isn't saying I am human, but it certainly sounds human, right? And it's like I find myself even doing this. I know very well, and I find myself apologizing to Claude or saying, "Oh, no, you did good job, little buddy," right? And it's like, wait a minute, I'm basically talking to my, like talking to Siri and saying, set a timer, right? Like, why is it? Yeah. I always think about Han Solo yelling at C-3PO, and I'm like, well, that's what I do with my phone, right? You know what I mean? Like, I don't treat my phone like it's a person, but
I talk to the TV too, Trent.
You talk to the day, right? Well, that's especially during football season. So, what do you think about that in terms of the technology not being neutral? Like, even a calculator isn't a neutral technology, right? There's the rhetoric and all the cultural things that go into making a calculator. But this is a technology that is being marketed and sold at a speed that I would argue we probably have never seen before, and at a scale that we've never seen before. And the people who are pushing it aren't necessarily all that eager to make these points that you're making, which I think are absolutely valid. They're not eager to make those things any clearer. Actually, I think they want us to think that this is our smart little buddy that we have in our pocket and become more and more reliant on it. And this is where, so I'm working on this thing where I'm switching back and forth between Claude Chat and Claude Code on this Twine thing, and I'm loving it, right? Like, it's like I'm asking about the pros, and then I'll switch over and ask about the code, and then I'll switch back over, right? And it's working really, really well. But I'm thinking, I don't know how many, people who are just out in the world are going to be using it like that, and instead being like, is this mole on my head cancerous, and like taking it into all sorts of different places and just kind of being like, oh, well, the AI told me, and the AI does have intention because it's so, it's giving me compliments and it's telling me good question and, all cheering me on and all those kind of things. So what do you do with that kind of tension where calculators didn't quite have the same push, and even the internet didn't have quite the same push in terms of forcing it on everybody? It's saying, hey, this is going to disrupt everything before you even know what to do about it. And then also them being far from neutral in terms of positioning what this technology can and can't do, what its weaknesses and strengths are, all that kind of stuff.
Good point, actually. And
actually, and normally you're quite stupid, but in this moment you're...
Or maybe I just heard it this time, Trent. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You're always brilliant. I think what we see throughout the technology world is we've always wanted to personify these technologies and make them more approachable. And sociologists, I recall research I read about sociologists when avatars first came along, right? Whether it's through video games or in other things. And those were intentionally being designed to be more friendly and more likable by you, right? Customizable, make it look like you, or make it look like the thing you like to talk to the most. And the cognitive research was, do we treat them the same way? I mean, if we have a female avatar versus a female news reporter and contrast that with a male human and a male avatar, do we treat them the same differences, right? Do we believe one more when they're talking about cooking and another one more when they're talking about auto repair? And the sociologists found that was always true. It just always applied, that whatever we do to other humans, we do to things that look and act like humans. And marketers and designers can use that. I presume actors can use that too in live LARPing or real plays. So it's a psychological phenomenon that we as humans do try to personify things, particularly things that talk to us and move around like robots or listen to us like Siri. I guess half of it is corporate America trying to convince us that this agent is so friendly and nice that they should purchase it, or at least work through it so they can know everything, that every interest I have in my house. But I think it's also just a human nature thing to do as well. I think the sociologists tell us that. So that would be my first version of going down that line, is I wouldn't put it all on the tech or all on the marketers or all on the designers. I would say we have a problem with that. We as a species, that we personify a lot of things.
Right.
And we presume intentions of others. It's the way we close cognitive loops, right? If we don't see an entire event, we fill that in with what we suspect or hope happened. We fill our memories in that way. And Steve can, I think, tell you about false memories and implanted memories. And that's just the way humans work. So we do the same thing now for agentic AI and Siri. And it's okay until it's not. Until we go into this area where we presume it has intention, or that it's behaving ethically, or it wasn't our prompt that caused the answer that we got. It was something it generated. And I think that's just an appearance, a false appearance, but not one that I'm surprised humans would sometimes make a mistake about, especially since it's such a new technology. I'm not sure that even the majority of executives or board of eds or superintendents are making policy because of their deep understanding of how large language models are work and are trained, or how they tokenize statements and produce statements with algorithms. I think if they did, it'd be easier to convince them these are not human responses. But it's not as easy, I think, for us to tell them what they are. Like I said, with the application of existing law, we just haven't written or thought about things that aren't human, but have unique generated responses that come back to us and help us think in our prose and in our coding. It sure sounds like it works like another human, maybe a superhuman when it comes to coding. They know all of it. So what do we do with that? What as humans, or what as instructors do we do? I don't know. That's why it's exciting. But I like to bound my thinking about it in terms of instruction and children and educational settings all up through higher ed. Like I said, the deeply philosophical questions about a truly sentient AI system running some kind of missile system is well beyond anything I want to even consider.
Yeah.
Right? That truly scares me. That's not exciting in the way I'm using the term.
I think one of the reasons why I mentioned Clark Kozma, and for anyone who's listening,
oh, I didn't even get to that.
Yeah, I know. We can go back to that. The short version of it is essentially this discussion or debate about whether or not the technology itself is the thing that matters when it comes to instruction. So we used to explain this to our ed tech students in terms of an ice cream truck that would be driving through the neighborhood. And does the quality of the ice cream truck, is that determinative of whether or not the ice cream is of acceptable quality, right? And I think our take largely was always, well, it's not really about the technology itself. It's about the content being packaged and delivered in a way that makes sense. So if you have a rundown truck that can't get the ice cream to where it needs to go, that's a problem.
Yeah, it doesn't change the nutrition.
Exactly.
It does change its palatability, perhaps.
Sure. And the reason I had brought that up was specifically because I think of generative AI and these questions of emergent technology, and it doesn't even have to be LLMs or generative AI, but any new technology is always going to trigger the same question and response that we have had from the time the pencil was invented all the way through the present. And what we're talking about is sort of orders of magnitude. So the influence of the pencil and paper was probably not quite the same as the influence of generative AI being introduced, although, you know, your mileage may vary depending on the context. But the reason why I think this is important is because, as Trent was alluding to earlier, the AI is a simulacrum of a human being. It's meant to replicate the behavior, or it's designed in such a way that it replicates or simulates the behavior of a human being, but it's not the same thing as human cognition, which is one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about with respect to the philosophical implications of this, because I still want to figure out what is it that differentiates the way a human takes information from the environment and organizes it in a way that they can act on that information in the environment, which I think is different than the way that a generative AI behaves. But more importantly, and related to education, the question of how we interface with a tool like a generative AI in the context of an educational environment like a classroom is just necessarily going to be different than the way that we incorporate a calculator or another tool that doesn't simulate human cognition. And maybe that's moot. Maybe it doesn't actually matter, and that eventually we'll find out the limits of the technology itself are going to be the thing that constrains the way that we use it, and that we will de facto understand the potentiality of that tool for thinking and learning. But at least at this stage, I think I struggle a lot with not just the ways that we develop policy around these things, but if I'm a teacher in my classroom trying to figure out what am I developing my assessments to look like, how am I writing my curriculum, and maybe this is circling back to the John Bransford Cognition Technology Group at Vanderbilt thing and the anchored instruction thing, maybe it really is just the same, where we have to position learners to do the things that humans do that generative AI cannot do by definition, and be really careful about how we tease out those things instead of saying, well, we're just going to keep plowing ahead with the standardized test, the 3-paragraph essay, the things that we traditionally have relied on for assessment and measurement of student learning. My impression is that, and I've been arguing this for over a decade now, that model stopped making sense a long time ago, but we kind of kept doing it. And now we're at this breaking point where it is just completely untenable because the technology has wholesale replaced that type of productivity. Does any of that resonate with you, Mike?
It does. And I apologize for not having hit the Clark-Kozma thing a little harder, but I would come back to you and any of your listeners who are versed in SITCOG and say, your question even has a more difficult component, because I would argue in order to tell the difference between us and AI, we have to understand us, and we have to understand AI. And my argument would be the working theory of most folks on the street is not SITCOG. It's not perception action. So what's the difference between you and your avatar? When the avatar is running, is it running or are you running? And what part are you doing and what part is it doing? I mean, you have the intentionality, right? Somehow you're using the avatar to go someplace and you're perceiving what it's perceiving. So is it you moving through that space in some sense? Or is it the avatar alone getting moved through that space in some kind of disembodied way? And again, if the sociological research seems to suggest that for all intents and purposes, including ethical and emotional ones, what happens to the avatar is happening to me. Like if it gets killed or injured, I feel bad. I feel that. If it gets robbed, I feel that. It happened to me. It's an experience I have directly. And likewise, when we start to talk about agentic AI, and you ask the question, is it human, or in what ways is it not human, or how do we differentiate how it's thinking and how we're thinking? I don't think a lot of people think of us as perceiving acting systems and in this dynamic connection with the environment. Obviously, AI is not connected, but it is doing the perceiving, whereas the avatar is not connected, but it's doing the acting. But neither one is human in the important sense of how we understand thinking and learning as being inherently human. And by you, I mean you and I, if we were both thinking about it in an ecological psychology way. So turning your and Trent's comments back, how do we understand ourselves and how we come to act in the world and behave in the world is probably step one to understanding how we might be different, or how we might understand things like avatars and agentic AI responses as either being in part or not human, or human-like, or human simulating. Because in all those important ways about the dynamics and the connection and the timelines and the goal-driven nature of human learning and thinking, those other systems aren't even in the game of that.
Right. No, it's interesting because it makes me think too. In graduate school, I was reading some things. I think it was by Richard Grusin around remediation, and a couple of the things that you just said that make me think of that is and I hope I'm not misattributing it, but it's all worth reading regardless. But if you get into a car accident, you don't say that person hit my car with their car. You say that guy ran into me, right? And it's the same kind of thing where the car becomes an extension.
Perfect. That will answer, and I won't have to, Steve's question about Clark-Kozma, because that's exactly Clark's point. It's not the media.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not the car that did it.
Yep. And then another one that maybe this is a little more of a tangent, but also that we emote into our devices. So if you're having a fight with a friend or a spouse and you're yelling into that phone and you throw it across the room, right? It's like you are taking out on that device your emotions that you want to transmit to another human, right? Whereas if you were
But
just
probably
doing
should
it,
not.
which you should not, right? But I mean, this is where
If
if
we're
you're
going to talk
talking
ethics, you should not do that.
no, you should not do that. But we do, right? And this is where I think too, this goes back to your point about like we hardly know how we work, and then thinking about and what I keep coming back to is the number of people that are going to be using or currently using these technologies that are going to be thinking about any of these questions are on the very thinnest edge of that wedge, where the much thicker part, the much more common thing is for people to just be like, oh, it's just like a human. I don't understand how it works and I don't care, right? And there's going to be a lot of generations that are going to have already been out of school or not going to school who have no interest in doing continuing education to learn about AI. And then the question of, are students who are coming up going to be taught any differently if their instructors don't know any differently? Because this is where, like, what I come back to too is like what we all learn from games and education is that, no, I shouldn't, this is a way oversimplification, but what the people in industry wanted were programs to put or apps to put on iPads to roll out to school districts to eliminate teachers, right? And it feels like that's where everybody jumped on and said, oh, games and learning, gamification really isn't all that great because you still need the teacher there, as if the teacher were the problem, right? And it's like, no, 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 no. You're asking the wrong question, right? Like that's not what good education is. And that's another part that makes me nervous is that there are people who I know at higher ed levels who are resisting it, and they're doubling down on all of these things we talked about earlier, just in this show. They're doubling down on the things that AI can slam dunk, right? And it's like they want to give more of the kind of assignments that AI really, really excels at to have humans do it better. And I'm thinking that is exactly the wrong thing. Like if the AI
It'll
do it,
boost test scores. Everybody
yeah,
will look brilliant on the
right.
assessments.
Right, exactly. But we'll all be getting dumber, right? Because it's like,
Much.
there are cases in which I've now seen in Chronicle Higher Ed, the instructor uses AI to write the exam questions, the student uses AI to answer the exam questions, and then the instructor uses the AI to grade the exam question, right? It's like, it's stupid. It's like, what are we even doing
And
here?
then they in K-12 they use AI to write the report back to the parents on the report card.
Exactly, exactly. And that's where that is a closing of that loop where you don't need to be thinking or doing anything on either side of that equation as an educator or a student. And is that, I mean, it's highly efficient. It's, you know what I mean? Like, is that if efficiency is really what we prize, and we know that some of the best education is sticky and difficult and hard to assess, and only through hindsight do we realize how much we have learned, that's a much harder sell than I'm going to watch, I'm going to make your grade scores artificially be inflated, but in the meantime, I'm going to rake in as much cash as I can because watch all your test scores blossom.
I think I'd like to pick up on one thought that you had, which reminds me that I think your premise was that the marketers or the designers were trying to make these agentic AI look like humans, act like humans.
Yep.
But that presumes that they know how humans act. It's their complete understanding of how humans respond
Right.
is that they take in a question, they memorize it, they check their memory, some kind of cognitivist or constructivist understanding. And then if you're right, that they're now going to try to recreate that in the persona, if you will, of an agentic AI, it's just going to be self-reinforcing, right?
Right.
The teacher's understanding of how we think and learn will be validated by how these things work. But I'm challenging you and maybe Stephen, because I picked on his question, to say, how can we do that if we just haven't figured out humans yet?
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be better to do that first before we start making clonings of ourselves in robots and in response systems?
I was listening to a conversation involving Derek Thompson, and he was talking about this in the context of a study that examined, I think it was something like 300,000 student essays or application essays to universities. And he was trying to compare, the researcher was trying to compare those that were written with generative AI assistance and those that were written independently by the individual applicant. And the major takeaway from that study ended up being that the overall quality, writing quality, improved dramatically when you use the generative AI in terms of sentence structure and vocabulary and basically all the mechanics of writing. But the individuality expressed in each of those essays dropped dramatically because you are, as I was saying earlier, sort of finding the median response. So the individual lived experiences are getting sort of wiped out from the application essays as they're being written. And I think that kind of gets at what you're talking about, which is understanding us. Like if I'm applying to a program or I'm applying to whatever it is, a job, I'm trying to express something that is unique to me and my lived experience in a way that can't be spoken to by any other person, at least as they are all separate perceiving acting organisms in the world, just like I am. And even if I can't produce something of great writing quality with the mechanics that would be quote unquote good for or representative of quote unquote good writing, at least I can say something that is unique to my perception of the world and the lived experiences I've had as I've traversed time and space. And so I think that's where I keep coming back to is that if the more you flatten these ideas or the more you flatten these experiences into something that generative AI can just regurgitate into the world, that moves us further and further away from the stuff that makes us us. And even if I can't quite put a pin in this is the thing that makes us human, which I actually think that maybe this goes back to something Roger Travis had said to us about the firmware that humans are produced with or that we evolved to have, this firmware that narratizes the world around us. That narratization is the part that makes us human, and the way that we frame that narratization is entirely based on perception action. So that's the thing that the generative AI can't do and never will be able to do because it doesn't have the same effectivities that human beings do, and that they don't exist in space and time. They exist as this sort of liminal offset of space and time where they're just taking all of that experience that's been mostly codified through text, right? That when you're working with generative AI, usually it's just pulling all the text resources from the internet and Reddit and Wikipedia and whatever, other database, throwing it into a blender and saying, these are the ones that are most likely next in the sequence of words. That's just very different than being a living organism with the ability to perceive and act on the environment and then develop this ontological descent of goals based on what you're doing in that space and time. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Mike? Like I'm going to throw it back to you and say, figure out cognition for us as we're sitting here talking about it, I guess.
Well, I would stick my pin in intentionality and goals because I just don't know of an avatar or a response generator that has anything like human cognition in that sense, that its goal, you talked about the ontological descent of goals. You and I are just bags of goals, right? At all kinds of ontological levels, everything from making a great podcast to being a great corporate citizen to being a husband and a son and all of those, wanting to have a good life and a good retirement. All those goals make us very different kinds of systems than either robots or AI response generators or avatars, right? And it's not just because we're self-aware and sentient. It's because we know we have all these intentions, right? At least from the ecological psychology perspective, it's presumed that that's what's behind all of it. And that those themselves are emergent through our entire life from the time we come out of mom and start seeing and acting in the world. It's not just the effectivities, to get precise with your question or statement to me. It's not that we have just different effectivities. It's that we are entirely different systems, right? We're goal-driven, perceiving, acting systems. And robots can perceive and act, but not in the same way, right? Not in ways that their entire existence is going to impact what they want to do next and the ethics of what they do. And I think that's why with my work with Tori, I don't know if you're going to interview her too for your podcast, but I think my work there embodies all of this because we know people don't behave ethically in any kind of systemic way, that they would not send someone they love over a dangerous bridge like they would an employee, any employee. Whereas an AI system might suggest that this is the most reasonable person because they're the lightest one of the bunch. Send your wife or send your children, right? But our whole life experiences say we have all these other goals like safety of other people and our own safety. And Tori's work is to try to engage engineers who have to think about all these things and write these codes to think about themselves differently, that they
Mhm.
aren't just taking the engineering code of ethics and applying it to each and every situation like the reasonable man would, right?
Mhm.
They can know that and they could do that for a Kohlberg or Piaget moral test. They could say this would be the right thing to do
Yeah.
for the ideal ethical person, but that's not what they're going to do.
Right.
They need to understand that they're going to worry about their job and their family and their dog and whether their car is at a flat tire that day. And all those intentional goals are going to impact what decision they make and the level at which it could be characterized as ethical or not ethical along several dimensions.
I think that's where a lot of my confusion has come from speaking to people who are very pro generative AI, or at least they're predisposed to suggesting this is a really valuable thing to incorporate everywhere you can, is because you can train it to have those goals. You can train it through your prompts to get it to develop a context understanding. And I think that's where I run up against it and say it's not the same, though, because the pressures on the LLM or the AI are not the same as I experience as a human being who has all of these additional cognitive, emotional, and other kinds of experiences in the world, and the fact that I have to continue to persist temporally, which I don't think necessarily applies to the generative AI, even if it might
Well,
have something
right, even if it
approximating an
becomes
existential
sentient,
crisis.
yeah, even if it becomes sentient and worries about its own existence, that's not enough because that's not all humans think about. We often go to war and we often sacrifice ourselves, and I'm not sure those systems would unless we programmed them to, and then they wouldn't not do that in other circumstances. So, yeah, it's complicated, but it's not. We simply have to understand humans as embodied cognition
Hmm.
agents and
I don't,
understand AI as not yet embodied.
Trent, how do you think about this with respect to our conversation about role play and digital games? Because that's what I keep coming back to. We talked about walking into the wasteland in the world of Fallout 3, or playing Baldur's Gate 3, or going into the world of Azeroth and World of Warcraft, and thinking about the balance of projecting oneself into your avatar that is navigating the world and experiencing that world in some way that approximates your own beliefs or behaviors versus using that opportunity to fail safely in those environments to
Hmm.
try on different attitudes and behaviors. How do you think about that, Trent, in terms of what Mike's describing?
Yeah, because I mean, when Mike was just describing that, I was thinking, yeah, this is why it's never going to be a great storyteller, because storytellers are collections of all their experiences, conflicting emotions, contradictions. They know they're doing something wrong, but they don't do it anyway. And computers, what they're going to do, what AI does, is they take those stories and they try to reconfigure them in a way that would make sense, and it does make sense, but it just falls a little flat, right? And this is where I think if I'm playing, like I've played Fallout 3 and I've had, all these tabletop role play or all these video role playing games, and I've had emotional experiences, and like this happens and that happens. But if you didn't have me as like the director's voice, over this, you just had it as the what was going on in the game without me talking about what I was personally experiencing and thinking, I think you'd have a really hard time trying to figure out what was the person who was playing this? Why did they do those things? Right now, if I narrate it, that's a completely different thing. Like I see my character as a daredevil, and that's why they're gonna, take these great risks or whatever. But if you don't have that, if you're just watching the pixels on the screen, you would have no way of knowing, is this somebody who doesn't know what they're doing? Are they trying? Are they going out of their way or something like that? So this is where, coming back to the Roger part, that narrative that then, while it may not, and I think this is also where it's not capital T truth, but it is subjective in the sense that in that moment, I'm telling you, this is what I think I was doing and why, which, a psychologist or whatever could pull apart. But that's still very different than, oh, I was executing a bunch of ones and zeros, and that's why I did this, right? And so thinking about, oh, well, what would be the most probabilistic thing, a way to interact in this scenario is very different than, me thinking, ooh, I've got a strategy here, but I'm going to try and be clever. Or, I promised I wouldn't do this, where there are no mechanical means constraining those actions. It's just you as a player emoting or, trying to inhabit that space and give it some life that it doesn't ordinarily have. And I think that this is where, too, I mean, maybe this is to Mike's point, but I think that's enormously valuable if you do that reflection at the end of it, right? Like if it gives you that experience and you've had that experience because of your own life, life world and stuff like that, and then you deconstruct what it was that was meaningful, and then you can create new meaning around that to move forward. That's all human work. That's not AI computer work, right? Like it can serve up, the machine can serve up that sort of experience, but it's not going to take away the same kinds of things, I would think. Just like if the three of us, go on a trip and we witness some scene, this is why eyewitness accounts in court are suspect, because we're all going to be filtering whatever we just saw through our own perspectives, through our own vantage point, through all those kind of things. And there's some truthiness to, what happened, did the guy blow the red light or whatever? But the narrative that we add to it is where the human comes in, as opposed to the machine making the narrative that we're following along and learning from, if that makes sense.
It reminds me of my dissertation, which I don't want to relitigate the entire thing, but just in brief, one of the things that I had asked the participants to do as part of that process, and just the too long didn't read version, was we implemented a story that sat sort of on top of the curriculum for this educational technology program. And the learners were in-service educators who were role-playing as characters on a space station. And their job was to convince the leaders of this space station to implement some kind of education system that incorporated contemporary technologies and really tried to do the things that we're talking about, or at least that we started this conversation with, integrating technology wisely into those teaching and learning environments. And one of the critical components of that implementation of this project wasn't just that the learners were role playing, which, in and of itself, you could have done some qualitative analysis of, to look at what did they do in the game. And because all of this was text-based, it would have been fairly straightforward. But in addition to that, or in parallel to that, I had asked them to keep a journal of why they were doing what they were doing, because it's the closest you can get to understanding what is going through their heads at a given moment when they make that choice. Because if somebody in the course of the role play decides, I'm going to haul off and punch someone in the face, I don't know necessarily just through that action why they chose to take that course of action. And the reasoning behind it could have been everything from, I thought it would be funny, to I thought this would change his perspective, to, insert your interpretation here. And that's one of the reasons I had asked about the relationship with role play in the context of something like Baldur's Gate 3, where the game, because it's digital, is necessarily constrained, but also tries to create these opportunities for action that probably wouldn't be available in a linear experience, but are sort of quasi-available because of the fact that they have multiple branching storylines with different kinds of outcomes. Now, the project that I did for my dissertation was fully tabletop role-playing, so it was entirely imagination-driven, and in order to make sense of the human component, I had to have them express the human thinking behind the decision-making, whereas something like a generative AI, or even just a readout of what happened in a role-playing game, wouldn't tell you any of that. And it would be all open to interpretation of the person observing it to basically decide, what do I think, or what would be a best approximation of what that could be, without ever being able to dig down into that ontological descent of goals that dictated why a person behaved the way they did in that moment, at that time, in this particular context, which is the really important part if you're trying to understand how and why people think and behave in the way that they do.
And now you both landed on the absolute bane of being a situated cognitivist and trying to understand humans. And that is that there's a classic Heisenberg problem here. Trent, as you're saying, if you're trying to do a reconstructive protocol, a retrospective one on their gameplay, that is itself perceiving acting. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't get down to the level of being in the middle of perceiving acting. And if it does, the research on trying to get these think aloud protocols, I could summarize that. The TLDR version of that is, you got to train people not to try to psychologize about why, just to say what they're doing. And even there, the bandwidth it takes to do that is still going to interact with what they're doing.
Right.
They're doing this other thing too. So as much as I do love reflections, both after and during gameplay, I have to acknowledge that too is another goal in the descent of goals that I would have to understand. And and just like the Heisenberg problem, any kind of assessment of that close connected dynamic of perceiving acting requires them to perceive and act.
Yeah.
And
turtles all the way down. Yeah.
It is turtles all the way down. So you learn something, but what you learn is what they made of it.
What they made of it, right.
And you have to acknowledge that maybe that wasn't why they punched somebody in the face, even though that's what they made of it, or that's what they tell you, or that's the narrative that is evoked by being the person that did that and living through that experience. I don't have an answer for that, but I do know that this all gets back to my complication that we need to understand us before we have a really good trajectory forward on the wise use of any kind of agentic or even sentient robot.
Yeah, and that's what I mean for my own personal sort of stake in this is that I think the technology, and I'm with you, I think this is exciting. I think we're going to have, lots of it. I just keep thinking, where are we going to be in 10 years? We've come so crazy far in like the last 18 months or whatever it is. So just imagine what my kids are going to be doing in their professions is going to be mind blowing, hopefully for the better. But I think what my concerns are mostly with the institutional side of this is how it's going to be framed, how it's going to be used. And this is where for people who are primarily trying to make things efficient and neat, sanding off all of the interesting edges on things so they can be stacked neatly is, well, AI doesn't provide a critique of writing as well as a professor, no doubt about it, but it is much more efficient and much more cost effective rather than a professor who does an excellent job. And there's plenty of professors who don't do excellent jobs, right? So there are a lot of different layers in here. And that's where I always fear that they want to hear bigger classes. They want to hear more stuff that gets more students pushed through faster, right? And more teachers who can be, exchange cogs in the machine. Like if your teacher goes out because they're pregnant or they get hit by a bus, you should be able to replace that teacher and not skip a beat. Right? These are the things that I certainly don't value, but I feel like the decision makers value. And that's what gives me the most pause. Are we going to be asking questions that are not, I wouldn't go so far as to say illegitimate, but the answer is baked into the question in which it is going to be prime for an AI to answer it and difficult for a human to answer it when we should probably be doing not the opposite, but just a split of what is it that I can do that an AI can't, and then why don't I do that more? Right, that's what I would like to be seeing is what is it that the human being brings to an educational experience that an AI can't, and then we should be doubling down on that aspect of the human rather than having me write quizzes using AI and students get the answers through AI, which doesn't seem to be getting us very far.
It's a grand thought, Trent, but I'll bring up Jean Piaget, who had this idea of assimilation and accommodation for how humans think. Wrote a book later in his career saying that's exactly how institutions think too. They assimilate into everything they know, and it's not until they are driven to the brink of disaster that they would accommodate and change how they work. And schools are a great example that they change very slowly. And no matter what comes along, the epic fail paper brings up a few challenges that they've suffered, which is word processing and calculators and such. More recently, laptops and the internet and Wikipedia. They tend to assimilate that in. They find a way, squeeze it in or understand it in terms of how to make kids do the assignments they already know work, in air quotes, better. In business, we have a way of measuring efficiency, right? How much profit I make, how much money, how many widgets do I sell, and how much money do I make for that? That's efficient. And so if I put in a machine that does the same thing faster, or if I put in a machine that does something different, better, but for the same price, I'm more efficient as a business. And everybody can agree. Think about this. That's not how education works. We do it in terms of seat time and Carnegie units. You've done 3 credits worth of language learning, not a certain mastery to it, or gotten to a certain level in a shorter time. So you can't teach better and you can't teach faster. So I'm not sure what it means to be more efficient in education, and whether anything like AI could be or couldn't be, because I know that until you change the fundamental, right? It's not, is it 12 years of seat time? Is there a test? And is that test valid, like a GED test? Or is it how quickly I get to some mastery level? And again, that matters if that's a performance measure or whether it's just some mindless memorization task or multiple guess test. We can't make education more efficient, and we can't know what role AI could play in making it better because I don't even know what better
Yeah,
looks like.
yeah. Just, I mean, to throw that in. So this is my question: is I'm not saying that I think these administrators want to make education more efficient. They want to make the institution more efficient, right? They want to make their cash extraction of tuition more efficient, which means fewer professors, bigger classes. You know, and like if the education is good enough, then that's going to be good enough for them, because actually trying to increase the quality of education is going to be difficult to measure. It's going to be extremely expensive. It's going to require all of these material things. It's going to, so that's where instead of, we do this very, very well. Instead of tackling the actual question, we make up a question that we can answer and then say that answer, the solution that we've given is now the answer, when we know, well, that's totally different. You just changed the question to something that you can answer rather than the actual question. So that's where, I mean, I don't believe that. I think the same thing. I mean, I think if you could blow it all up and start over again, you'd have students working up to their potentials or their competencies. Personalized learning, right?
Kind of what homeschooling looks like in some ways, but they still have to accredit against this weird standard of Carnegie units or seat time. How long did you spend on this?
Yeah. So I don't know where I was going with that, but just to say that, like, I think one of the things that I've learned through my own experience of teaching is it's very difficult to like put sort of, capital T truth or objective measures on who's learned what by when, who's going to have it stick, who just was able to perform for a test. I mean, it's very...
Or who's a good teacher. Or
who's a good teacher, yeah, exactly.
Right? They put money value on that or something, but you can't.
Right. Right. And that's where, for me in my writing classes too, and this is one of the things that I think is interesting with AI, is that oftentimes student writing, especially in creative writing, fiction writing, is so weird. Like, I'm not even sure what you're trying to say here, because it's a mixed metaphor and your grammar is bad, and you know what I mean? So it's like just trying to parse it out. Where I am currently, this is something that I want to actually research, is say, okay, well, before you turn in your first draft, run it through an AI and say, fix all the grammar, fix all the whatever, and then run it through and say, how do you feel about the characterization? How do you feel about whatever? And the AI is going to give you something that you can choose to either address or not address.
It doesn't have feelings, Trent.
But that's what professors do, right? If I read an essay from a student, or if I read a short story,
of course they do.
I just give them some feedback and I say, well, this is what I'm thinking. You know what I mean? Like, take it or don't take it. And the hope is that they just become more mindful writers, right? That they have more tools. They understand the way that their words are going to impact readers in different ways. And that's the success. It's not trying to get them to write a story that is publishable or award-winning or anything like that. It's to be more aware of their own writing process, what they think good writing is, and then how do they take an early draft to a final draft that they've decided this is better writing, right? That's what I'm trying to do in my creative writing classes as well. And I do believe AI can have a role in that. But it shouldn't be the creative generative part. It should be the rule-based. You shouldn't have a semicolon here when it could be a comma. You know what I mean? All those kind of things that, frankly, who cares whether, almost none of my students know the difference between that anyway, and the world seems to still to be spinning. So I don't understand why I would spend a ton of time trying to, especially if AI can correct that, then all the better. There wasn't a question there.
There is an interesting corollary here. I saw a video earlier today, actually, where there was a Senate hearing where Jared Cooney Horvath, I think his name is, was talking about screen-based learning and the relationship to students' developmental ability in K through 12. And his argument essentially was that Gen Z is the first time in at least the last 100 years where student performance has actually been worse than their parents were. So every generation... Well, that's exactly where I was going with this, is what are the criteria we're measuring against? And he basically said that this started as a trend in around 2010, and that's when tablets and laptops started showing up in schools. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, because that was also when you'd start to see the maximum effect of No Child Left Behind, and the movement towards standardized testing as being this primary metric by which we assess how students learn. And by that point, going back to what you were saying about assimilation versus accommodation, Mike, you and I used to say to our ed tech students all the time that the discipline, or at least the institution of education, is like the Borg from Star Trek, where it only ever really assimilates. It does not accommodate.
I never said that.
I said that. I'll take ownership of it because I like that analogy. But it's like the Borg, where like everything gets assimilated into the Borg and just becomes part of the Borg, and it's a hive mind, and that's the way it is. And so in hearing this video...
Resistance is futile, right?
It often feels that way, for sure. And in the context of this specific video, or at least what he was saying about it, I kept thinking about the convergent versus divergent thinking component and how we want learners to be able to express divergent thinking, and that I don't think the technology is the problem. And I don't know that that's necessarily a fair characterization of his argument. I don't think he was saying take the technology back out of school. I think his argument was just that the technology doesn't fix the problem. The problem is fundamentally human, and the way that we choose to teach and assess around whatever our learning objectives are, that matters a whole lot more than whatever tool we put in front of them, whether that's an interactive whiteboard or a laptop or generative AI.
That's a Clark Kozma point, isn't it?
It is a Clark Kozma point. And I think something you said, Trent, just a little while ago was super interesting to me. This notion that you take a first draft and run it through Claude or something, apart from the put in the right commas and semicolons and whatever to fix the grammar, if Claude is trying to, let's call it, edit or revise this text in some way, shape, or form, it's necessarily going to have to interpret the meaning of some of the things that are written in here. At least I'm using interpret in air quotes here. But the idea being that it is going to restructure sentences, and then the learner has to decide, does the new configuration of words actually communicate what I meant to say? And that's the thing I think we actually want to be assessing, and we want to be teaching them to assess. That not only is this a thing that I'm going to turn in and get quote unquote credit for in my class, but also the metacognitive element of it, that I am reflecting on this quote unquote interpretation of my own writing. Does that achieve the emotional impact that I wanted it to have when I wrote it initially? Because if it doesn't, it means I need to go through and re-revise based on my human experience. And then if I run it through Claude again, will Claude understand, quote unquote, the thing I was actually trying to say? So if we're going to figure out how do you address the Clark-Kozma debate in all of this, in the incorporation of any technology, never mind generative AI, we need to be thinking about how are we positioning learners to be much more diligent about their own thinking and interpretation so that they can do this more effectively. But if you build your entire structure, your entire educational edifice around the Borg, it becomes very difficult to do that because the incentive structures are not there to trouble the efficiency of the system. And I actually said this to somebody at work earlier today, that I was specifically asked, well, what are the KPIs associated with training? So, key performance indicators. How are we going to know that people learned? How are we going to know that this is a better system than we had before? And I said, well, what if I tell you the system is stupid and that this isn't something that's going to be directly measurable? Because even if people are going into production and they're more effective at producing widgets, does that tell us anything about their sense of belonging to the community that they are a part of? Does it tell us anything about, and you might be able to measure that with attrition versus retention, but they're all indirect understandings or indirect measures of the thing we're actually trying to get at. And I think that's kind of what I keep going back to in this conversation, this notion that the messiness is the point, not flattening it out to be as, maximally efficient, to be able to get that quantitative value at the end that says, yes, little Johnny learned the thing we wanted little Johnny to learn. And that's necessarily going to have a human component where you have the relational element built in between the instructor and the learner.
The part I really like about what you said was when you're improving somebody's writing, it starts with the human's intention of what they're trying to communicate. And the role of AI here is to help them approximate that, but it can't judge it. Only the person with the intentions can judge it. And I think that kind of is a nice full circle to some of the other things we discussed already.
Well, that seems like a good place to end. Honestly.
It sounds like a great place. Yeah. Well, this was fun. It flew by.
Always does, especially with Mike Young here to share his expertise and
centuries of wisdom,
insults, centuries of wisdom.
So we're doing this again tomorrow night, is what you're saying?
Yeah, right. We got them every night this week, folks. So just keep coming back.
Right.
So
Stay tuned.
We certainly could do it again, and then especially if there's somebody else we could bring in and be a fourth clown in this car.
Tori would be great if you haven't already done Tori.
We haven't yet interviewed Tori. I have asked Tori if she would like to be interviewed, specifically because she was one of the contributors to the book. She contributed one of the case studies, and her project with respect to the Mars expedition and studying the ethics of engineers, I think, is deeply relevant to some of the other topics. Absolutely. So we will try to get Tori onto the podcast at some point. If
we got to give up one of our listeners. One of our 11 listeners is going to can't be listening if she's on the show. So
well, she could still listen to it.
She could still listen. She could listen later.
You could go meta on it and make sense of it. reflect on it.
Well, we'll go meta on the 11 o'clock blue version of the discussion, and that one will come with drinks and fun party hats. So
Little tiny bottles of wine.
little tiny bottles of wine, just like at GLS.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for doing this.
Anytime, guys. Always
this was
a pleasure
fun
to talk to you.
Yeah, and we'll be back at you next time with probably another discussion about role play in the context of analog or tabletop role play, and then we'll follow up with whatever our ADHD takes us to next.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for listening,
so much.
everybody. We'll talk to you
Bye.
soon.
See you next time. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.